Hello, I'm Sean Munger. I'm That History Guy, and I teach history courses online. This is the second of 4 videos about the legend of buried treasure on a small island in Mahone Bay, Nova Scotia, Canada, called Oak Island, also called the Money Pit. If you haven't seen the first video, please go back and watch it because this springboards off of that one. This series is itself part of a larger series called Historical Thoughts, and in this series, I use the processes of history and the tools of historians to weed through various fakes, scams, and false impressions about the past. Oak Island, the Money Pit, is a scam. It's a very fascinating scam with surprising historical roots and really amazing resilience. It's been hooking suckers right and left since the 19th century. One of those suckers, believe it or not, was a President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who bought into the scam and bought into a treasure hunt company on Oak Island in 1909. The scam has been going certainly since the 1860s and possibly, I think, since 1849. But the bottom line is there is no buried treasure in or under Oak Island, and there never has been. In the last video, I talked about how there's no evidence for the flood tunnels, which are the key feature that every permutation of the legend says prevents recovery of the treasure by flooding the main pit. Any pit that you dig is going to be filled with seawater. So there's no evidence of flood tunnels on Oak Island. However, the believers in the legend will dispute this, and part of the purpose of this video is to address those claims. Seawater, in fact, does get into the pit whenever you dig down far enough. That's happened every single time anyone's gone hunting for treasure on Oak Island. You get lots of seawater pouring into whatever hole you dig. So that's documented fact. In a few minutes, I'll explain why that happens. So let's set that issue aside for now. While no man-made flood tunnels have been discovered on Oak Island, treasure hunters did find, in the 19th century, some very odd and suspicious structures, particularly on the beach at what they call Smith's Cove, which is a fair distance away from the traditional site of the treasure pit. These structures were kind of like shallow depressions that were lined with stones and then stuffed with coconut fiber and covered over with sand. So when the water would, the surf would come up and then recede, you would see water kind of bubbling out of the sand in this strange fashion. So that's how they were discovered. These structures, called box drains or finger drains, you hear that term used by believers in the legend, they're called that because they're said to resemble the fingers of a hand pointing toward the traditional treasure site. Supposedly, these structures were discovered in the 1849 treasure hunt on Oak Island. Invariably, these structures are said to be intakes for the flood tunnels. So this is supposedly where the water goes into the pit through the channels and empties into whatever hole is being dug to try to recover the treasure. So clearly, these structures are of human construction. There's no question about that. Why else would they be there except to siphon water in from the beach and channel it into the money pit? This is about the strongest argument that believers in the legend have. Well, what are these structures? The short answer is that they're remains of an operation to cook salt on the beach. Who built them? Fishermen, probably in the late 18th century. Why did they build them? Because they needed salt to preserve their catch of fish. And in a cold climate like Nova Scotia, you can't just evaporate salt on the beach like you can in other parts of the world. You have to cook it. So how do we know that these structures are salt works? Because under the box drains, the so-called box drains, there's evidence that there were fires laid on these stones for a long period of time. There's soil under these rocks exhibits scorching that looks exactly like that where we find in other known beach salt operations. As I said, they couldn't just dry the salt, they had to actually boil the seawater to distill out the salt, and that's exactly why they needed fires on these stones. The coconut fiber is not exotic at all, and the fishermen would not have had any problem getting it. Coconut fiber was common packing material in the 19th century, similar to the way that foam peanuts are used today. Salting was a way that fishermen have had of preserving their catches since ancient times. So the so-called box drains on Oak Island were most likely part of an illegal fish salting operation. So why an illegal operation? Why was this concealed? Well, because salt was very highly taxed in British America, and the fishermen were probably trying to avoid paying the toll on salt. Very simple. Incidentally, part of the Oak Island legend speaks of people who lived around Mahone Bay supposedly seeing lights and distant fires over on Oak Island decades before the supposed discovery of the treasure pit in 1795. While I personally don't believe the stories of the lights and fires, if they are true, if that did actually happen, a salt work of the kind I'm describing is exactly the kind of thing that would explain what people said they saw decades before 1795. You've got fires going all the time and people rowing over there in boats, and they're being very secretive about it because, of course, it's an illegal operation and they don't want the British authorities to know that they're salting fish there because they'd have to pay the tax. More importantly, why does this matter? No one would care about an old salt works on the beach on a place as remote as Oak Island unless it could be demonstrated to have something to do with the treasure pit, right? I mean, that's only common sense. The reason why anyone cares about the box drains is because, and I stress, this is the only reason people care is because they are supposedly the inlet to the flood tunnels that create the booby trap that makes the treasure so difficult to recover. The flood tunnels are the punchline of the whole story. I made this point in the last video. Without them, the legend makes no sense at all. And as we know from the previous video, the tunnels themselves have never been found. Believers in the legend conflate the flood tunnels with the box drains, but they're actually two separate things. If the box drains were connected to channels leading into the pit, it would have been the easiest thing in the world to follow them just right up from the beach all the way up to the main pit. Then what you do if you want to recover the treasure is you simply block off those channels, wait for the pit to dry out, and then go get your treasure. If it was that easy, this would have been done in 1849 or 1861 or whenever the actual first recovery effort was. But in fact, that didn't happen. So why? Why did this not happen? Because the box drains are in fact not connected to any flood tunnels, which do not exist. Furthermore, as we've shown, the scorched earth underneath the box drains proves that they were not intended as water intakes. I mean, why would fire be used to try to facilitate the influx of water into the supposed flood tunnels? It doesn't make any sense. So the fact that there's scorched soil and that the stones are very, very heavily scorched by fire over a long period of time, that makes no sense. There's no conceivable way that putting fires in these structures would have been relevant to keeping the pit flooded. It just doesn't make any sense. So there's no physical evidence of any treasure pit on Oak Island. The flood tunnel hypothesis was created to explain why, whenever you dig a hole on this island, it's flooded with seawater and you can't pump it out. Many of supposedly the early treasure recovery operations were built in the nature of trying to pump water faster than the previous one, and of course they could never do that. So, according to this book, which is one of the many self-referential pieces of literature about the Oak Island legend, supposedly some enterprising treasure hunters in 1850 dropped clay into the flooded money pit, and sure enough, muddy water seeped out, supposedly the other end of the tunnels at Smith Cove, far away, thus proving that there was a connection between the hole they dug and the outside sea. This experiment was also supposedly repeated in 1899 with red dye. So clearly there is a connection between the water in the pit and the water. Somehow it connects out to Smith Cove. So I told you why I was going to explain why this happens. The short answer for this is very simple. The highest elevation on Oak Island is 30 feet below sea level, 30 feet. So if you dig a 100-foot hole, and these have been routinely done in various treasure operations, you're digging 70 feet below the water line. The water coming in from the hole is seepage under high pressure from the surrounding seabed. The main objection I've heard to this argument that the influx of water into the pit is natural seepage is that it's impossible because the soils of Oak Island are thick clay, not permeable gravel. This is false, and in fact was proven false as early as 1867. There are some clay deposits, but they're interspersed with much more permeable soils. A geologic analysis was done on Oak Island in 1867 and came to this conclusion, and in fact that matches exactly what has been found when geologists have examined the island in more modern times. So the original geologic analysis of 1867 showed that there were very permeable soils that allowed this water to seep in, and that conclusion has been reaffirmed with every subsequent geologic analysis of the island. Some reports of the early treasure hunts, those predating 1861, include a reference to a stone that was supposedly found in the pit, with inscriptions on it, because of course. Incidentally, this book here that I showed you earlier talks a lot about the stone and the inscription, but the Wilson & Wilson book that I showed you in the last video, in fact, doesn't even mention it, so that's odd in itself. No one is sure exactly what the inscriptions on the stone are because no one has actually ever seen the stone. But it's said to be invariably something like, below here 2 million pounds are buried, or something to that effect. What's interesting about this is that the inscription did not become associated with the Oak Island legend until the 20th century. The stone's initial discovery has never been documented, and was possibly, if it did exist, was possibly not even found in the 19th century, or may not even have been found on Oak Island. The inscription is associated. The first source I can find that mentions this is New England folklorist Edward Rowe Snow. I love Edward Rowe Snow's work. His books are very, very entertaining. I did a video a long time ago on this channel about him. It is very colorful books. But Edward Rowe Snow, although he was a historian, he was known for spinning tall tales with no basis in fact. Incidentally, the stone itself has, of course, now disappeared. I know, convenient. Other artifacts that treasure hunters have found as quote-unquote evidence of a treasure burial, things like a shoe, a pick handle, those sorts of things, are most likely from previous treasure hunts, which have been going on for a long time, or else they were deliberate plants by various hoaxsters over the years. Archaeologists have never confirmed that these objects were found where and when they claimed to have been found. Since the 1960s, attention is focused on Oak Island on a shaft drilled near the treasure pit called Borehole 10X, supposedly which connects to an underwater cavern. Supposedly at one point a camera was lowered down into Borehole 10X, and artifacts like a shovel handle or even human remains were said to have been found. There is in fact no proof of this. The videotape of the camera expedition has conveniently never surfaced. In any event, divers went down to Borehole 10X in 2016 and found nothing. In short, there's no physical evidence that there was ever a treasure burying operation on Oak Island. No tunnels, no cryptic markers or spooky inscriptions that can be verified. Nothing that we can be sure was left behind by pirates or whoever it is supposedly buried the loot. There is just nothing down there. In the next video, I'll explain why the historical record does not support the legends of Oak Island treasure, and in fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about where this legend might have come from. Thanks very much for watching. Please subscribe, like, and share. Thanks.